Masechta Peah Perek Ches Mishnah Aleph. When is everyone, even the wealthy, allowed to collect leftover leket shikha and peah from a field? Once the poor people finish searching in a field or the orchard for the matnas haniyim, leket shikha, peah, etc., any gifts that are later found in the field are considered hefker and may be taken by anybody, even a wealthy person. Once all the poor people have gone through the field, it can be assumed that they give up hope finding any more gifts. They're miyayish. Thus, if any gifts are indeed still in the field, they become hefker because the owners, the poor people, were miyayish their right to collect them. Accordingly, everyone may now take these gifts. So, the Mishnah is going to discuss at what point is to be considered that the poor have finished with the field and when they're going to be miyayish. So, when is anybody allowed to collect the leftover matnas haniyim from a field? When the elderly poor people have gone through the field. The elderly are the last group to search a field because they walk slowly and therefore arrive the latest. Once they leave, any gifts, any matnas haniyim that are left may be taken by anybody. By the time this group finishes searching the field for gifts, all poor people give up hope of finding any remaining gifts there. The parrots of Eilulois. When do parrot and Eilulois, which are matnas haniyim from the vineyard, become available for anyone to take? After the poor people have gone through the vineyard once in search of the parrot and Eilulois on the vines, and then came back and searched the vineyard a second time. At that point, the aniyim are considered to have finished with the vineyard. Once the vineyard has been searched twice, the poor people give up hope of finding any more gifts there. Ubezesim, when the shikha and peah of olives become mutter for anyone to take, mishatered reviyashnia, after the second rainfall. The only two gifts granted to the poor from olives are shikha and peah, as we mentioned a few times previously. What does it mean, reviyashnia? During an average year, the second rainfall is expected in Eretz Yisrael on the 23rd of Cheshvan. By that time, the poor people assume that all the shikha and peah was all taken from the olive trees, and they give up hope of finding any more of it. The halacha is that an olive grove does not depend on when the nemushais come, because the olives are harvested later in the year, when it's too cold for the nemushais, the elderly people, to go outside. So really, the Gemara of Metzia says that there are two pshatim to the nemushais. Savi the Azli Atigra, which are Zakenim Ahelcham Al Mashantam, the old men walking with canes. Is the Mefarshi Lakute Bas Lakute, the lazy people that come after everybody else already collected, and they come and pick what they try to find. Rabbi Yehuda says, Rabbi Yehuda is arguing on the last halach in the Mishnah of Mishater Reviyashnia, Halo Yesha Ena Maiskam as they say El Achar Reviyashnia, but there's some people who don't even begin to harvest their olives until after the second rain. So how can the Tanna Kama say a general rule that everyone is permitted to take any remaining olives after the second rain falls? Rather, shikha and peah olives become mutter to everybody, becomes hefker when the amount of the remaining matnas haniyim is so small that if the poor person would go out into the olive grove to collect them, he would be unable to bring back 4 isers worth, and isers is a small coin. So 4 isers is enough to buy 4 meals, which is a day's worth of food for a man and his wife, meaning 2 meals for each of them. The poor consider anything less than this too small for an amount to be worth returning to the grove to collect. Therefore, they give up the right to collect, and it becomes hefker. Mishnah Beis. Nemanim ala leket ala shikha ala peah b'shaitan. An amaoretz is an unlearned person who does not properly observe the halachas of meiser. Generally, such a person is not trusted to say whether he took meiser of his produce. Therefore, when a person buys produce from amaoretz, the buyer must separate meiser, even if the amaoretz says he already did so. This is going to be part of the introduction to Masechta Demai, which is the next Masechta. The next few Mishnayos are going to discuss whether an amaoretz who's an ani is neman, is trusted to say that his produce is leket shikha and peah or meiser ani, which are completely potter from any meiser. As we learned previously in a few places, that all the matnas haniyim, leket shikha, peah, parrot, Eilulois, and meiser ani are potter from truma and meiser. So nemanim ala leket v'ala shikha v'ala peah b'shaitan. And amaoretz who's an ani is believed to say that his produce is leket shikha, peah, and potter from meiser, but only in the season, during the harvest season, when the matnas haniyim are left to the poor. Although amei oretz are not trusted to separate meiser, they're believed to say that the produce is a gift that's potter from meiser, as long as it's the season when the matnas haniyim are being distributed. And once the harvest season is over, though, they are no longer believed, and any produce received from them must be meisered. Since the amount of leket shikha and peah in the fields is relatively small to begin with, we presume that it was all eaten by the time the harvest season ended. But meiser ani b'chol shnasai, and they are believed to say that their produce is meiser ani throughout the year, which meiser ani is given. because Meiser Ani is separated from produce and given to the Aniyim during the 3rd and 6th years of a 7-year Shemitah cycle. At any time during the 3rd or 6th year, a poor Am Ha'aretz is believed to say that his produce is Meiser Ani and therefore patur from Meiser. Since Meiser Ani is a relatively large percentage of the crop, which is a little less than 10%, so the farmer will typically distribute it to the poor a little bit at a time over the course of the entire year. Accordingly, an Ani has access to Meiser Ani throughout the year, and he's believed at any time to say that his produce is Meiser Ani. Uben Levi Neman La'olam. Similarly, a Levi who's Am Ha'aretz is always believed to say that his produce is Meiser Rishon and that he separated Trumas Meiser from it to give it to the Kohen, and thus it may be eaten without the need for further Meiser. So Meiser Rishon is a portion that's separated from the crops every year besides Rosh Hashanah and is given to a Levi. It may not be eaten until the Levi separates from it another portion known as Trumas Meiser. It may then be eaten by anyone. Since Meiser Rishon is given almost every year, a Levi is presumed to have an ample supply of it at all times, and he's always believed to say that his produce is Meiser Rishon. He's also believed to say that he separated Trumas Meiser from Meiser Rishon, for although Amei Ha'aretz are not careful about the halachas of Meiser, they are careful to keep the halachas of Truma and Trumas Meiser. Ve'enam nemonim ella al davar shabnei adam ne'egin kain. However, they, whether the Ani or the Levi who's a Am Ha'aretz, is nemon to say that the produce is patur from Meiser only if it's a type of produce that people normally give, such as a gift, as will be explained in the next Mishnah. And what are they nemon to say? Zogt Mishnah Gimel nemonin ala chitim va'ein nemonim ala kemach v'le ala pas. The next Mishnayos are going to explain the halachas told in the previous Mishnah that Amei Ha'aretz are believed that the produce is patur from Meiser only if it's a type of produce that's usually given as such a gift. So an Am Ha'aretz as poor is believed to say that unprocessed wheat was collected or given to them as lekes shricha pei or Meiser Ani. Ve'ena manim ala kemach v'le ala pas. They're not believed to say that flour or bread was such a gift because wheat is usually distributed to the poor before it's processed and not after it's made into flour or bread. Nemanim ala sa'urav shel oirez. They're believed to say that rice was still in its shell that cover the grains of rice when they still grow. Is patur from Meiser. Ve'ena manim alav bein chai bein mevushel. But they're not nemon to say about rice whose shells have been removed, whether it's raw or cooked, because rice is usually given to the poor while it's still in its shell. Nemanim ala poil. They're believed to say that whole beans were patur from Meiser. Ve'ena manim al grisam lechaim lemevushalim. But they're not believed to say this about crushed beans, whether they are raw or cooked, because beans are normally given to the aniyim when they are whole. However, they are believed to say that olive oil, which was given to them as Meiser Ani, because it was common to give Meiser Ani from oil instead of giving the olives. Although poor Am Ha'aretz is not believed to say that he was given flour as a gift to the poor, he's believed to say that he made flour from grain that he was given, and the same would apply to rice and beans. But with olives, though, the halach is different. They're not believed to say that the olive oil was made from forgotten olives, from shikha, because there are usually too few of these olives to press into oil. Where does they say nikuf mean? It means knocked olives. The poor would collect olives that were forgotten on the tree, which are shikha by knocking the tree to shake the olives loose. A person would not make oil unless he has a significant amount of olives, more than the few that are usually left as shikha. A person would make flour, though, even if he only has a small amount of grain. So therefore, a person is going to be believed to say that he made his flour from the matnas aniyim. Mishnah Dalet. Nemanim al yarok chai ve'ein nemanim al mevushel elim ken hoy lo davar muat. So the Mishnah discusses the distribution of Meiser Ani. After a farmer separated Meiser Ani from his crop, he stores it at the threshing floor. So the aniyim come to the threshing floor, and the balabayas distributes the Meiser Ani to them. And Am Ha'aretz, however, if he says that he got the vegetables raw and cooked them himself. This Mishnah is going to talk about the minimum amount that a farmer must give to each poor person from various produce. Sorry, got confused over here. Let's go back. Nemanim al yarok chai. Poor Amei Ha'aretz are believed to say that raw vegetables were given to them as Meiser Ani. Ve'ein nemanim al mavushel. But they're not believed to say this about cooked vegetables, because Meiser Ani is usually separated from vegetables before they are cooked. And Am Ha'aretz, however, is believed to say that he got the vegetables raw and cooked them himself. Elim ken hoy lo davar muat. But he's not believed unless he has only a small amount of cooked vegetables. In that case, he is believed that there are Meiser Ani. Shekein derech balabayis lias meitzim ulefasai. Because it's common for a homeowner who forgets to set aside Meiser Ani from his raw vegetables to remove a few cooked vegetables from his pot, and set them aside as Meiser Ani. If a person realized after he cooks the vegetables that he had forgotten to separate Meiser Ani from them, he would simply take a few vegetables from the pot and designate them as Meiser Ani. This way the rest of the pot could be eaten. However, this is only done with a small amount of vegetables, because a person might forget to take Meiser off a small amount of vegetables before he cooks them, but wouldn't cook a large amount without taking Meiser off them. Okay, Mishnah Hey. Ein person la'aniyim b'goyren mekati chitin mekati kav v'kav sa'orim. The Mishnah discusses the distribution of Meiser Ani. After a farmer separates Meiser Ani from his crop, he stores it at the threshing floor. So poor people come to the threshing floor and the farmer distributes the Meiser Ani to them. In contrast, the other gifts for the poor, the leket, shricha, peah, pert, and edelais, are simply collected by the poor on their own. The Mishnah is going to list the minimum amount that a farmer must give to each poor person from various crops. In person la'aniyim b'goyren, when distributing Meiser Ani, a farmer may not give each poor person at the threshing floor less than a chatzi kav chitim, less than a half a kav of wheat, v'kav sa'orim, and a kav of barley. The minimums listed in this Mishnah apply during the harvest season, which is the summer, when the farmer distributes Meiser Ani at the threshing floor. Once the winter rain arrives, so the farmer brings all the grain into his house to protect it from the rain and distributes it from there. At that point, there's no minimum requirement; he can give it as he wishes. This is learned out from Psukim in the Torah. So he can't give less than a chatzi kav chitim and a kav sa'orim. The Torah says that a person must give Meiser Ani to the poor so that they may eat and be satisfied. This is understood to mean that a poor person must be given enough Meiser Ani to satisfy him for an entire day. Since a person usually eats 2 meals a day, each Ani must be given Meiser Ani for 2 meals. All the amounts listed in the Mishnah are 2 meals worth of food. Meir says the minimum for barley is a half kav. Kav v'chaytzi kusman. A farmer may not give each poor person less than a kav and a half of spelt, the kav gregris, or a kav of dried figs, a mana dvela, or a mana of pressed figs. A mana is a unit of weight. Wheat, barley, spelt, and dried figs are normally sold by volume, and thus are measured in kavim. Pressed figs, though, are usually sold by weight, and thus measured by the mana. Chati lo yayin, a farmer may not give each poor person less than a half a loig of wine. A loig is a measure of liquid. Rabbi Kiva Amir Revius, Rabbi Kiva says the minimum for wine is a quarter of a loig. Revius shemen, a farmer may not give less than a quarter log of oil. Rabbi Kiva Amir Shminis, Rabbi Kiva says the minimum of oil is an eighth of a loig. Usharkal aperis, as far as other produce, that is types of produce that are not usually eaten as a meal or part of a meal, thus may be sold to purchase other food. So Omer Abba Shaul said a poor person must be given enough of the produce so you could sell this produce and use that money from the sale to buy food for 2 meals. Mishnah Vav. Midas u'amura b'kayhanim u'balavim u'b'Yisraelim. The Mishnah continues discussing the distribution of Meiser Ani. These minimum amounts of Meiser Ani that a farmer is required to give each poor person at the threshing floor, which was mentioned in the previous Mishnah, apply to everybody, whether they're Kehanim, Levim, or Yisraelim. Because the Torah says the Meiser Ani is to be given to the Levi, to the Ger, to the Yosem, and to the Almona. Since the Levim are recipients of Meiser Ani, one might think that a Levi does not have to give Meiser Ani to the others. The Mishnah therefore states that a Levi or Kayin must be given Meiser Ani just as the Yisrael must. The Torah says that Levim receive Meiser because Levim were not granted a Chelik in Eretz Yisrael and were generally poor, as we know already from the Birkas Yaakov, and Shimon, and Levi. Hayom Matzil, if the farmer wants to save some of his Meiser Ani for his poor relatives and friends who are not at the threshing floor when he gives out the Meiser, so Netel Mechza, he may remove up to half of the Meiser Ani and save it for them, V'noisen Mechza, and he has to distribute the other half to the poor people who are there already. If after setting aside half the Meiser, the farmer had too little Meiser to be able to give the minimum amount to each Ani who's at the threshing floor, then, rather than giving a poor person less than the minimum amount, instead he places all the remaining Meiser before the poor, and they divide it equally amongst themselves. Mishnah Zayin. We don't give a poor person who's traveling from place to place less than mikikor bepundin me'arbaso and basela. After we discuss the distribution of Meiser Ani to the poor, the Mishnah discusses the halachas of giving food to the aniyim and giving tzedakah, as we will see. Mikikor bepundin me'arbaso and basela, then a loaf of bread that costs a pundion at a time when 4 sahs of wheat cost a selah. That means that if a poor traveler passes through a town, the local tzedakahs must give him at least this amount of bread, which is enough for 2 meals. When wheat is the proper price, 1 pundion will buy a loaf of bread that contains a quarter cup of flour, which is enough for 2 meals. So they must give the ani a loaf this size regardless of the price of wheat. So although we learned to Mishnah Hay that an ani must be given a half a kav of wheat for 2 meals, that was referring to unprocessed wheat. The process of turning the wheat into flour and then into bread will cost the ani half of his flour. Therefore, a half a kav of wheat will yield a loaf of bread that contains a quarter of a kav. So, and that would be the normal amount that a person eats each day. If he stays in town overnight, they must also supply him with his needs for the night, which is a place to sleep, a bed, and bedding. Shavas, if he stays in the town over Shabbos, they must provide him with food for 3 meals rather than 2, because on Shabbos a person is obligated to 3 meals, to eat 3 meals. Interesting, would Rav Chitzka hold over here that you would have to have 4 meals? The Mishnah now discusses 2 types of tzedakah. One was tzedakah called a tamchoy, which was a plate, which was a fund of prepared food that was distributed to poor travelers who had no food. So a poor traveler who had enough for 2 meals may not take food from the tamchoy, because that fund is designated solely for those who do not have enough food for the day. But mazon arba esrei sudas liital min hakupa. Another kind of tzedakah was called the kupa, to which every family in town contributed a fixed amount of money every Friday. The money was distributed to poor residents of the town to cover the cost of their meals for the coming week. So a poor person who has enough food for 14 meals may not take money from the tzedakah, from the kupa, because that fund is designated only for people who cannot afford meals for the coming week. This person has enough food for the next week, he has 14 meals, it's enough to last throughout the week, because he has 2 meals a day. Although he needs to eat 3 meals on Shabbos, 14 meals are enough for the week, because he can eat the 3rd Shabbos meal late in the afternoon, and he will not need to eat a meal at night. Although a person is obligated to eat a meal after Shabbos, Malava Malka, he is not obligated to eat this meal if he cannot afford it. The money for the kupa must be collected by a team of 2 gaboim, because the collectors have the legal authority to tax the townspeople to contribute money to this fund, and tax must be collected by a minimum of 2 people. We have a halacha that any position that carries the authority to raise money from the tzibur must be shared by at least 2 people. It's a Mishnah in Shkolim. This learned out a pasuk from the Torah. Since the tzedakah collectors can force people to give the fund, there must be at least 2 of them. Lefisha mamashkinin al tzedakah. The Mishnah says in Shkolim that we're mamashkin al tzedakah. Ve'enais nisrar al tzibur parchas mishnayim. There needs to be at least 2 members of this heading this fund. Mischalekes b'shloisha, and the money from the kupa must be distributed to the poor by a panel of 3 people. Since each poor person's needs must be assessed in order to determine how much money he deserves, the distribution has a status of a monetary judgment and cannot be made with less than 3 people, like the Mishnah says in Sanhedrin, so you got to do it with 3 people. Mishnah Ches, Mishi yesh le'masayim zuz. A person has 200 zuz. So how poor must a person be in order to take matan saniyim? So he's not allowed to take leket shich and payer meiser ani. 200 zuz is enough to buy food and clothing for an entire year, and a person who has this much money is not poor enough to collect matan saniyim. Dinner. If you have 200 zuz minus even a single dinner, which would be a very not significant amount, but because he doesn't have 200 zuz, he's still allowed to take matan saniyim. Afilu elef neitzun le'achas hareza yita. In fact, even if they give him 1,000 zuz at once, he may accept them all. Since it's only 1 gift, he may accept it, even though it will increase his assets far beyond 200 zuz, which is a big chiddush. You would think that it's not like that, but he because he's not getting, because he doesn't have mosayim zuz, so then he's allowed to take it. So what's the cheshbon of how to calculate whether a person has 200 zuz? Because a person may have some of it in cash, but the other parts of the money might be part of some other assets. If a person has 200 zuz, if a person has 200 zuz, but part of it was designated to pay back someone who lent him money, or to pay his wife's ksuba, the ksuba is a sum of money that the husband or the husband's estate must pay his wife if he divorces her or dies before her. Here, a person set aside a sum of money or certain items, so his wife could use them to collect the ksuba in the event of his death or their divorce. Harezi yital, he may collect matan saniyim, when we calculate how much money he has, we don't include the amount that's designated to others. In addition, we're not mechayiv a person who has less than 200 zuz to sell his house or his kalim, his household utensils, before he can be allowed to take them out in saniyim. That is, that the items that he uses regularly, such as tableware and clothing, even if he has valuable utensils, such as gold or silver dishes that he uses on Shabbos and Yom Tov, he may keep them and still collect gifts meant for the poor. So these assets are not counted when calculating whether a person has 200 zuz or not, in order to be eligible to get the tzedakah. Mishnah test. If someone has 50 zuz, but he does business with the money, he's not allowed to take matnas aniyim. Since he's able to use his money to earn enough to support himself, he's not eligible for tzedakah. The Chachamim determined that 50 zuz that's used for business is equal to 200 zuz that's not being used, because either one can support a person for a year. So therefore, this person has the equivalent to 200 zuz. So even though he doesn't have 200 zuz in cash, but because he knows what he's going to be making from his investment is going to be worth 200 zuz, so then he may not take any matnas aniyim. The Masechta is going to end off with a discussion about tzedakah, and the Mishnah is going to describe the consequence of taking tzedakah improperly. The rest of the Mishnah refers to any form of tzedakah, not only matnas aniyim. So, anyone who doesn't need to take tzedakah, but takes it anyways, he will not leave the world until he loses his possessions and becomes dependent on other people as a punishment for taking tzedakah. When he doesn't need it, he'll eventually need tzedakah. But anyone who avoids taking tzedakah but instead struggles to support himself and does not take tzedakah, although he's eligible to take the tzedakah, he works hard and makes do with less and manages to support himself without the help from others. However, if a poor person is unable to support himself, he's obligated to take tzedakah rather than go hungry and endanger his life, and especially to endanger those of his family. So he will not die of old age until he becomes wealthy and supports other people with his own money. And about such a person, the pasuk says, pasuk in Yirmiyah, Baruch HaGever sheyiftach b'Hashem v'haya Hashem ivtacheh. Blessed is the man who trusts in Hashem, that Hashem will be his source of trust. The next pasuk promises that a person who has b'tochen b'Hashem will be compared to a fruitful tree that spreads out its roots. This implies that such a person will be sustained by Hashem and will be able to share their sustenance with others. So when a person does not resort to tzedakah but trusts Hashem for his needs, Hashem will respond and take care of that person's needs. Similarly, a judge who delivers true judgment l'man ha'emes and not to do it to make money, so he'll be rewarded by Hashem. Such a judge demonstrates that he trusts only Hashem and is not swayed by any other concerns, but wishes simply to arrive at the truth. Therefore, he's included in the pasuk's promise of a reward to the man who trusts in Hashem. Any person who's neither lame nor blind or crippled. Lame refers to a person who's crippled in one leg, and a crippled refers to a person who's crippled in both legs. And he acts as though he's crippled in one of these ways, so that people have rachmanus on him and give him tzedakah. He will not die of old age until he indeed becomes sick like one of these cripples. Like the pasuk says, tzedakah, with justice shall you pursue. So justice, tzedek, can also be interpreted to mean tzedakah, which would be charity. So the pasuk can be read, tzedakah together with tzedek, you should be running after, which means you should seek tzedakah legitimately and not take it if you don't need it. It's interesting because the Gemara Gittin says on Zayin Amud Beis that the Gemara gives various pirushim on the pasuk, but one of them is that it's referring to the Talmidei Chacham shemarm hilchos shchita ba'atzmam, that when they're practicing hilchos shchita, they pass the knives over their neck, and they show how to do shchita on themselves. So it's like, we would say today it's like ayin harim. So you shouldn't do that. It's the same concept over here as well. Any judge who accepts a bribe and thereby corrupts the judgment, he will not die from old age until his eyes dim and he becomes blind. So the pasuk says, you shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see. The simple meaning of the pasuk is that bribery prevents the judge from seeing the truth, and he's biased in the case that he's judging. The Mishnah teaches that the literal meaning of the pasuk is true as well, that a judge who accepts bribery will become blind. And there's a story with one of the great Paiskib who was a dayan, and he became blind. So he was mispal HaKadosh Baruch Hu that if he's a dayan and he's going to become blind, so then people are going to say, hey, maybe he's taking sheikhad. So he was mispal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he got his vision back, and that's it. Baruch Hashem, we're Messiah, all 8 prakim of Masechta Peah. Mitzvah Hashem to be continued soon with the introduction to Masechta Demai, followed by Parak Aleph of Demai.